Hello and welcome to Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast, a podcast where we discuss all things relating to your well-being, ranging from nutrition to physical and mental health. I am Amanda Hayes, your host, a nutritionist with a passion for well-being. Before I introduce today's guest, I will take a moment to let you know that you can subscribe to my podcast on YouTube, hit the red subscribe button, or on your favourite podcast app, iTunes, Stitcher, Spreaker, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. I will also mention that although I will often be speaking with experts, any information or advice provided in Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast is not intended to be used to treat, cure, or prevent injuries or medical conditions, and it is not a substitute for advice from your own health professionals. Today I am here with Caroline Weber. Caroline started her professional career in the book publishing industry. She's held several positions in Sydney and London, including with HarperCollins, and then returned to Adelaide where she established a publishing company, Inc. Publishing. In 2016, Caroline started working towards a significant career change. She studied a Bachelor of Psychology and followed that with a Master's of Counselling and Psychotherapy. So hi Caroline.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. So I'd like to start the conversation by asking you about your career change from the publishing industry to becoming a counsellor and psychotherapist. What inspired you to study psychology and psychotherapy?
I suppose it probably started with a chance encounter at a dinner party where somebody asked me, what I was doing. And I'd been in publishing for a long time and I suppose looking for a bit of a change. I'd done everything in publishing that I wanted to do. I worked for some very good companies. I had probably seen every problem that a book could go through. I didn't feel there's anything more I wanted to do with publishing, and most of my roles in publishing was actually dealing with other people. I worked with a lot of European publishers, a lot of Asian publishers, so kind of had to, nuances about personality. So it seemed a kind of a natural fit. I've always been curious about people. So the switch in my mind was actually sort of fairly logical. I'd always been working with people around publishing, although books were the focus. And I thought I'm interested in people, so I put sort of formalise it and do some sort of study. So
okay.
That's how it came about.
And why psychology? Why not any other form of therapy?
I suppose I was quite intrigued. It sort of came at a time where I was quite interested in the brain. There's a lot of behaviours that we have that are completely beyond our control. And I guess I was sort of just, discovering that and sort of quite intrigued by that. So I think there was sort of, I was interested in our brain responses in personality at that point. So I think that's what intrigued me particularly about psychology.
And had you done some reading about that kind of thing before you started studying?
Yeah, I had. Only because a family member had been diagnosed with OCD, which I didn't know much about.
Right. And
kind of the brain, the way brain behaves, I found particularly interesting. So, yeah. That's what
and you studied that one at Adelaide? Oh, Uni SA. Uni SA. Right, yeah. Was that an on-campus or an off-campus?
It was a bit of both.
Yeah.
Yeah, they try to get you on campus a bit, which I have to say is a better way of studying, I think, to be face-to-face.
Yeah, I think so. You're more engaged, I expect, if you're on campus. In terms of making the career switch, was it difficult leaving something you knew so well?
No, I think, like I said before, I was probably a bit ready to move on from publishing, and it was actually really invigorating. It was really stimulating, and I really thoroughly enjoyed it.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So, no, it wasn't a wrench.
No, it sounded like, from what you've said, that you were actually ready. Yeah. In fact, it sounded like perhaps you were almost a little bit bored in the publishing industry.
I'd seen pretty. I'd been really lucky. I'd had I worked for great publishers, and there wasn't a problem I hadn't seen. I wasn't being challenged, I suppose. Right, it was time to engage your brain again. That's how I felt. Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. So now you're working in the area of adolescent mental health, and can you tell us something about some of the issues that you confront?
We work with 12 to 25-year-olds, so it can vary, depending on the age of the child. So if the child's younger, the presentations will usually be around school bullying, trouble at school, maybe being precluded from school, those sorts of behaviours. And then you get into the mid-teens where they might be having trouble with family because they're naturally wanting to sort of become independent and they're being held back for whatever reasons, parenting, not being able to get to sports because they don't have cars, that sort of thing. And then the older ones, you can be around work, stress around not being able to find work, money, be able to support themselves. So kind of each of those age groups will have their own kind of challenges.
With the younger children, for example, who are experiencing bullying, are the parents involved in this in the services you offer at all?
Yes, generally. If the children come in and they're quite young, you always have to really work with the families.
Yeah.
When a child is in the home, they're very constrained by what the parents' choices in life are. For example, I'll always start with the child, what they're eating, what they're sleeping, what their sleeping patterns, and a lot of that's dictated if they're very young by their parents.
Yes, of course.
So I would always involve a parent with a younger child, particularly if there's sort of their sleeping routines are a bit out and they're not eating properly, which can lead to behavioural issues in school. Yeah.
I guess that can be, I'm sure, a fairly delicate area to deal with when you're asking the parents to change their behaviours as well.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it can be sounds a bit critical, so you've got to be very careful.
Yes.
You're not judging them, you're just making suggestions.
Yes, I guess that's part of your training though, isn't it? Knowing how to deliver those messages to people.
That's a big part of it. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And with the adolescent children, do you see any drug-related problems or alcohol abuse?
Interestingly, it's part of the community, but the young people coming into Headspace, which is where I work, the children are quite particular that they are quite against it.
Oh, that's it. Very interesting to hear.
Yeah.
Is it because they want a life that's different from perhaps what they've witnessed?
Generally, that's it. Yeah, that's the position they take. They've either had family members, they've seen it in them that they don't want to replicate. I'd say that's the majority. Yeah, they just don't want to have that sort of destruction in their lives.
Well, that's actually really heartwarming to hear. It is, isn't it? Because you don't really hear those positive things reported in the media. It's more about how things go wrong.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so I feel quite inspired when I'm with them. I think it's really good news too.
Oh, that's good. And what about gaming? Is that something that causes issues, social issues, addiction? I'm not sure.
Yeah, particularly with the younger people. I think particularly if they're having social anxiety or they're struggling at school, autism tends to sort of help them. It can either sort of keep them at home and disconnected if it's not used properly. But I have noticed children with autism, it can often be a way of them actually having quite a nice social group around gaming, as long as it's managed and it doesn't take over. But it can actually be quite a positive thing for some children.
So I've actually seen that with a friend as well, with one of her children. It's been really positive for him. It's how he's made his friends.
And they'll often go and talk to, look forward to going and talking to their friends, and they'll often talk, quite openly about what's probably, a problem for them, online, which is a nice thing for them.
Oh, that's good. And the next thing I wanted to ask you about is, how do you deal with some of those issues? Like what are some of the tools that you give to patients or clients?
Well, probably all of them. I'd always start with the first meeting is really getting to know them. 80% of psychiatrists, psychologists, no matter who the therapist is, 80% is the relationship. And if you haven't got a good relationship, you're not going to get very far. We do have to ask them quite invasive questions in the first session, so you've got to kind of balance that with, kind of getting to know them without sounding like you're interrogating them. But I always ask about eating, exercise and sleeping, because if you haven't got any of those foundation things, it's very hard to build on any kind of sort of therapy. So I always start with that. And then depending on the personality, it might take a long time to get to know them, get them to trust you. So it's really just getting that established first, and that's the most important thing.
So I imagine that it varies in time with different clients.
Different problems, that's right. Because once they do open up, you're in a really, they've got to trust you. And a lot of these young people have huge trust issues. They've been let down by various systems, family.
Right.
So once you've got that, they've invited you into a really kind of precious place. So you've really got to be very respectful of that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite a privilege to have that relationship.
That's how I see it. Yeah, they've opened up to a stranger often.
Yes.
That's incredibly challenging. If we can imagine ourselves doing that, it's a really huge
Yes.
thing to do.
But in some ways it might be easier because it's someone a bit removed from their day-to-day life.
Yes, I think that does help. I think with younger people, particularly young teens from 12 sort of to 14, there's quite as an adult, you have a fair amount of power that you've got to be very respectful about, because you can ask them questions and they feel probably obliged to answer you.
Right.
So you've got to be very respectful that you're not
stepping over boundaries
over that,
or
letting them have the voice. So that's a real juggling act too.
So I guess that would also be part of your training, was it, to work out how to elicit those answers?
And often they will be the first people that ever ask their opinion about a problem that they're
Right.
having. Most people try to sort of teachers or parents will try and straighten it out and maybe lecture them.
Mm-hmm.
So we might actually be asking questions that nobody's ever asked
Right.
them before. So it will take them a couple of sessions to kind of get used to that change in dynamic and kind of be able to think and offer their opinions.
Yes. And if you come across a client that has none of the basics you mentioned, the sleep, the exercise and the good nutrition, do you have to start from that point?
Yeah, I think you do.
Yeah.
I saw a young lady the other day who wasn't sleeping at all, and when I asked her what she was eating, she said nothing.
Oh dear.
So until you've got those things sorted out, so we went through, you've got to eat, and we sorted out some sleeping. She did really well. Often suggest she goes to the GP and maybe get a rundown with, just some sort of basic health stuff. So we're often bringing GPs to make sure that young person's,
Yes, because if she's not eating properly, she could have iron deficiencies or all sorts of things.
We can't quite often ask for that to be checked out, particularly if they're sleeping too much, which can be a sign of depression, but it could be just a sign that they need to get some of those things.
Yeah, it's a bit of a maze, I imagine.
Yeah, you're a bit of a social worker, GP,
yes.
referrer, just a basic screen, yeah.
Yes.
You definitely have to do that early on.
And then I think it would be interesting for our listeners to understand a little bit about the difference between psychotherapy, so that's what Caroline does, and psychology, because even I didn't quite appreciate the difference. I asked Caroline a few questions and had some of the terms a bit mixed up, so perhaps Caroline can set me and anyone who else needs to know, set us straight.
Well, psychotherapy is quite a well understood discipline, I suppose, in the US and in Europe, but not quite so well known here. So the distinction between a psychotherapist and psychologist is probably where people get sort of tripped up. So a psychologist will do advanced training in sort of diagnostic and looking for symptoms. So they'll have their client and they'll be looking for symptomology. It's kind of a very medical model. We need psychologists because they're trained to do, specific screenings for things like autism, some of the sort of more serious mental health issues. So they will often also be trained in how to work with clients, but not quite so much in the kind of counselling space. So they will be looking for symptoms. Mm-hmm. They will do a lot of screening, that sort of thing, with questionnaires, that sort of thing.
Right.
So quite orientated around writing, cognitive, kind of Western ways of thinking.
And a diagnostic sort of approach.
Yeah, so you might, and they work with the DSM-5, which is a manual.
Yes.
So they would be, it's very kind of manualised treatments as well. Whereas psychotherapists, we would tend to look at the person's presentation and go back deeper into their lives that could be causing those problems.
Right.
So we would not look for symptoms.
No.
Though we are mindful of those because we would refer to a clinical psychologist if we thought that this child needed to be screened for autism, for example.
Right.
We would refer to them. But if they are just acting out at school and they're angry, we would be looking perhaps around social anxiety, what is causing that, and maybe working with the family to see, what behaviours, are the result of these things happening in their lives. We will go deeper into their lives.
Right. Now that's very interesting, actually. it looks like you're finding the root of the causes.
Yeah, that would be a good way of describing it, and trying to work around solving that.
Yes.
Rather than saying you've got ADHD, these are your symptoms, you might go into a medication for that.
Right.
The ADHD bit might be because they're not sleeping at night because a parent is coming in and unloading their troubles in the middle of the night on that child, and the child is sleep deprived and anxious when they're getting to school, they're acting out, that sort of thing, and that's not uncommon. And
I imagine a lot of those problems and symptoms and things are all interlinked anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, no, it does sound like it's quite a difficult area to, you need to tread lightly in some ways.
You're a bit of it's a bit like, I find it a bit like being a sort of, you're a bit of a kind of investigator, but you're sort of putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And if you don't understand something, you've got to keep going until you fully understand it.
Yes. Yeah. So you've got to be quite persistent.
You do. Yeah. And you have to think quite creatively. And young people, well, actually probably everybody can probably have blind spots to what's actually going on. So you've got to be attuned to that. They might not be able to articulate something, but you've got to sort of be able to kind of see something that perhaps they're missing.
And I imagine also it might take a few sessions for you to get to the real, I guess, the bottom of the problem or the nitty-gritty, because people are often ashamed of problems that they have themselves and don't want to talk about it. So it takes a while to bring that out.
And everybody's very... people, when something works for them, for example, if you're anxious and you don't like public speaking, is a good one, most people would just avoid it.
Yes.
And if that's working for you, you'll keep doing it, even though you know that it's probably not the best way to go. So people can get very, very stuck on really unhelpful behaviours, and sometimes it needs to be pointed out that it's unhelpful, even though it works for them.
Yes, I guess, and if no one else around them is doing it, it's up to you. I expect.
Well, that's right. Yeah. And trying to gently kind of, the other role of psychotherapy is not to be so much guiding them in the solution, but actually helping them to find it within themselves.
Right.
To find that solution for themselves, and that works on their strengths and the skills they already possess, and also trying to obviously sort of guide them into other skills that might sort of open up that awareness and sort of.
And so I know you haven't been working for too long in this area, but have you seen some successful outcomes? Is it something that, is it an ongoing relationship that lasts for years, or I guess that depends very much on the problem, doesn't it?
It does a bit. I saw a young lady yesterday who, when we last met, was quite distressed. Things had shifted in her family. Again, she's quite young, so it was around her mother was feeling a lot better around quite a severe mental illness. She was a lot happier, so we kind of agreed that perhaps maybe seeing each other monthly in case she needed a bit of a hand.
Yes.
Which is what we decided to do. So I will always sort of agree with that young person, how often we recommend that we meet up and kind of what our objective will be, and then when they look like they're doing well, we'll put it on pause because they're busy, they're at school, they're at uni or whatever. Give them a chance to kind of negotiate what they think they need, and they seem pretty clear about what they find helpful.
And I guess it's ultimately it's empowering the person to have.
Well, I think that's really
tools.
Important. Yeah, and in fact, if they don't feel empowered, they're not going to really engage. So it's very much about them controlling it.
And so, in terms of, I guess, mental health issues, especially with adolescents, can you give our listeners any tips on maybe some signs? It's probably a really broad question, actually, I'm thinking as I ask it, but perhaps things to look out for in young people if they're struggling.
Yeah, I think with adolescents, a lot of it can just be normal adolescent behaviour, but withdrawing would probably something that might sort of ring an alarm bell. Change in behaviours can be, it might be suddenly not sleeping terribly well, not wanting to eat, not showering, and I can probably hear other parents or teenagers saying,
not showering, that's normal, isn't it?
So, but I think changes, and I think probably just have the courage to ask if there's something that you're not sure about. Just ask, respectfully.
Yes.
And if they do say they're not feeling great, maybe don't launch in with a lecture. Just just listen. I think listening is so important.
Oh, yeah.
And you'll be surprised what they'll say.
And moving on from that, because Caroline's had an interesting career, she's also given countless hours of her time as a volunteer at Meals on Wheels. I think you were there for 16 years or something?
I'm not sure.
Longer?
I sort of lost track. It just sort of rolled on. But
so what did you do there?
I can't remember my title, but I would coordinate the drivers.
Right.
So I would. We were delivering to about 100 people a day. We would have maybe 4 drivers and 4 deliverers. So I'd just make sure everybody was coming, and if they weren't able to drive, that we would have drivers in place, and I would be the one if there was ever a bit of a incident, which did happen with older people. Sometimes they'd be found on the floor or that sort of thing. So I would go and sort of help or liaise with the family. And importantly, I think with Meals on Wheels, if we can't raise an older person, and because the deliverers are fairly regular on that route, they'll get to know the behaviours of the people they're delivering to. So if anything seemed a bit out of place or doors left open that was unusual, or the house wasn't locked properly, or it was different, we would then contact relatives and say, look, it doesn't seem right, or we couldn't find them, and we would certainly never just leave them. So, so there was quite a lot around that. Oh wow. And the meals, were they cooked in the office, or not office, the kitchens? So they cooked all calorie controlled for the older age group. So that was 3 courses, and the specialist meals, which I think it was low sodium and gluten free, tend to be done by a commercial kitchen, which is also a Meals on Wheels facility. And then we would do also frozen meals, which would have been done by the commercial professional, and they're frozen appropriately, and then they would be delivered so people could put them in their freezers too. It's a great service. It's been around for a long time, hasn't it? Yeah, it's a really good service, and I think for a lot of families it was a way of sort of keeping kind of a just making sure that somebody was going in each day or every Thursday, and if mum wasn't answering the door, we often, if they weren't well, we'd be ringing the relatives saying, look, she just didn't seem that well today or something like that. So keeping an eye on them. Little red flag service as well. Yes. And were the people working there mainly volunteers? Everybody. Yeah, there's a head office that does the accounting and the kind of that sort of corporate work, but no, everybody. No, it's a great thing to do, isn't it? It's a very good organisation. Yeah. And finally, Caroline, the question that I like to ask all my guests: if you could recommend 2 things that all people could do to improve their well-being, what would they be? Well, probably, exercise, diet and sleep would obviously be, get those things under control. I would say if there's an emotion that's unpleasant, look at it and understand it. There's got to be a reason for it, and I think if you're doing something, so I think this is 3. That's okay. If you're doing something that's working for you, keep doing it, and if it's not working for you, stop doing it, but keep doing what works. So that would be my advice. Thank you. Thanks so much for coming on Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast. That's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. And that was Caroline Webber. You can subscribe to Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast on YouTube. Hit the subscribe button, and while you're there, click on the bell to be alerted when new episodes are available. You can also subscribe on your favourite podcast app, iTunes, Stitcher, Spreaker, Spotify or Google Podcasts. And you can follow the podcast on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. Direct links to all social media can be found on the subscribe page of my website at www.amandaswellbeingpodcast.com. If you would like to contact me, you can send me a message via the contacts page on my website. Please feel free to suggest topics you'd like to learn more about and people you'd like to hear interviewed, and I'll do my best to deliver that to you. Producing the podcast is a labour of love. We put in a lot of time, money and effort behind the scenes. So if you enjoy Amanda's Wellbeing Podcast and would like to make a contribution via Patreon, PayPal or by Amazon to help ensure we continue to provide you with excellent content,
please visit the Contribute page on my website. Also and finally, please take a minute to leave a rating on iTunes. It improves visibility and will help me source some excellent guests. Thank you very much for tuning in. Eat well, move well, think well.